Hello, friends, and welcome to the Chabura. I hope you had a successful and enjoyable sequence of Muadim. We're excited to have with us our Rosh Bet Midrash, Senior Rabbi of the S&P, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, for a question and answer session with questions you guys sent in. Some housekeeping before we start. One of the beautiful things about the Chabura is the community and the network of incredible people that we have. So besides for the general shiurim and events that we have, we are working hard on trying to bring the Chabura to you and connect people in person. I know Avi Garson has been working very hard on the Chabura New York community with weekly study groups and get-togethers and events. So if you're in that area, I highly recommend you join their New York, New Jersey group to stay in touch with like-minded folks. For those in Florida, specifically in Miami, I recommend joining our group, and some exciting events are in the works. I'll link the WhatsApp links in the chat box. With that said, thank you everyone who sent in questions. Thank you everyone who's here live, anyone who's going to be listening after. Chacham, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rav Ohad, as ever, for your care in administering these sessions. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and for all of those who will be listening either on the audio or video for our question and answer session this month. Before we get started, there are two things that I want to mention. First is a b'siman tov, and a mazal tov, to Rabbi Yitzhak Berdugo, who is a great teacher and participant in the Chabura, and a tremendous Talmid Chacham, a dear friend. And we're very, very grateful to have him and his involvement and participation on the Chabura. But we want to wish him b'siman tov because he received his semicha for Dayanut, which is tremendous news, and Yehi Ratzon that he should be Moreh B'tzedek, that he should be able to teach and rule in Torah and Psak Din properly and rightfully. V'chol min din smochu lana, we should have Dayanim like him. To continue, v'shiyizkeh linchot le'omka didina, that he should be able to get into the depth of the Din, and to do so with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help well and strong and clearly and with a straight heart. And on a more sad note, I want to take a moment to mention, with terrible sadness and personal sorrow, really, the passing of my very dear friend, Rabbi Raymond Harari, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who was a rabbi in the Syrian community in Brooklyn and Deal for many decades, a dear friend, colleague, but also a mentor, and somebody that I can say really, really had absolutely impeccable midot, was a wonderful, wonderful Talmid Hacham, tremendous sensitivity and da'at to the needs of the tzibur, and a natural leader, and also somebody who was profoundly anav, was profoundly humble. And Rashi, on the pasuk that says Va'ish Moshe Anav, that Moshe was anav, was humble, Rashi is mefarish savlan. Savlan means that he was patient, that he was able to bear and tolerate. And Rabbi Harari had that midah in such an excellent way, really, such an excellent way, that I revered him. I was enamored with his leadership. I learned a great deal from him. And he passed away today, and it's a very sad day for me, and a very sad day for the Syrian community, and his family, of course, and so many of his students. He was the head of school of Flatbush Yeshiva, of Flatbush High School. He educated not only hundreds and hundreds of students, but educated teachers as well, and was a pedagogue in Jewish education. So I mean, I could, and I will say, I will post something about it on Instagram. I hope tomorrow, and I just want to take a moment here to mention him, as he is also one of the great Jewish educators. So it's appropriate also to mention it on the Chabura, which I told him about. I was grateful to be able to have some time with him this summer. Okay, so those are kind of things that I wanted to share, but we'll get into our purpose of meeting tonight, and those are your questions. all very interesting and stimulating questions, which I hope to be able to address appropriately and um, properly. Okay, so first question. This is a question from New York. I don't get many names here, I just get places, but that's fine. Okay, so a question from New York. If there are truly trillions of stars in the galaxy, and the odds of there being many other planets like ours with their own version of religion slash devotion to God is very high, does that detract at all from our religion or our understanding of our nation's intimacy with God? So it's a good question, right? Essentially, if I understand this question, in terms of, my own wording, the question is in the immensity, the unfathomable, really, immensity of our universe, the magnitude of our universe is really, really incomprehensible. We have millions of light years across. Um, it is likely that there are other planets somewhere in the universe, like Earth, many, in fact, other planets like Earth that, for all intents and purposes, should and would have life on it. Likelihood is far too, it's very much too far away for us to ever come in contact with. But nonetheless, there's no reason to assume that there wouldn't be. As a matter of fact, it's more likely that there is. And if there is intelligent life out there somewhere else in the universe, the question that's being asked is, does that detract from our religion? Why is that question a question? Because it is likely that those life forms that are intelligent life forms, and if they had the ability to be able to evolve and develop like we do, it is with all likelihood that they have as conscious and intelligent beings as we do, in whatever format they may have taken on that particular planet. Um, the likelihood is that they have some form of religion, and we would believe that there is some form of nivuah, some form of prophecy. And why would it be, right, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu would not engage in brit of some sort with whatever equivalent there is on that planet of a manifestation of Abraham and his children, right? That's really what it is. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the case. The only reason we would assume that that shouldn't be the case is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would need to somehow be exclusive with only one planet. Why on earth would HaKadosh Baruch Hu need to be exclusive with one planet? I mean, the more relationship he can have, intimate relationship that he can have, covenantal relationship that he can have, that we believe he is interested in. I mean, I've pointed out several times, and I'm writing in my book now, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Jewish God, is a God of covenant. Right? He enters into covenant on various levels, no less than 10 different times in the Torah itself, right? With regards to individuals, with people, with the whole world in this week's parasha, right? In Parashat Noah, which is the first covenant that we know of on our planet. Why would it be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not enter into covenant with all other intelligent, conscious, aware beings that could come to know him in the way that Abraham came to know him? And find the various iterations of a Yisrael entity all across the universe. There's not only no reason why it shouldn't happen. It is if it is there, then it almost absolutely it does and is happening. The question is, right, what does it mean with regards to Torah? Well, remember that Torah over and over again, right? The Hachamim remind us, Dibra Torah kilshon bnei Adam. The Torah speaks in our language, speaks in our language. And that means that Torah responds to the evolution of human life on this planet, right? So in another way, the Hachamim say, Esrim v'shisha dorot kadma derech eretz Torah. For 26 generations, the way of the earth preceded the Torah. Why? Because there needed to be a way of life that the Torah could speak to. And so there's no reason why the Torah would be given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or would not be given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to all of these other planets that may have intelligent life in their language and in their terms and in their derech eretz, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why the Hachamim recognize that the Torah has an abstract nature to it on the level of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This idea of, black fire on white fire, this idea of Malachim saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as brought in the Talmud, When Moshe comes to get the Torah, how could you give this precious thing in your treasury away to somebody born of a woman, right? Recognizing this particular manifestation on this particular planet of what you call humans. How could you give the Torah to them? Recognizing that Torah is in an abstract form, so to speak, that there are these kind of eternal principles of truth that is manifest and ultimately embedded and adapted to manifest in on planet Earth with human life. So why shouldn't it be, so to be able to manifest on planet X with whatever life there is there? Absolutely no reason whatsoever that shouldn't be the case. And the likelihood is that it is. It is so. I would be, if we were ever to find out something otherwise, which I can't imagine we ever will, it would be shocking, and we would really the answer to why not would be a much more difficult answer than why yes. Okay, so that is the first question. The second question, yes, how could it be that Dor Hamidbar, that the generation of the desert, right, the people, the Bnei Israel that came out of Mitzrayim, came out of Egypt, which was so close to God, consistently sinned? And this is the language of the questioner, right? I'm reading the question from the question. Consistently sinned. Or he says, David HaMelech, who wrote Tehillim, again indicating David had this very close relationship with God, brought himself to sleep with his servant's wife. Right, I'm assuming that he means Bathsheba, and I'm assuming that his servant is her husband who was serving in the army. It seems so simple to people in our day not to stray from God or do these deeds. That's questionable to me. I don't know why there's an assumption for that, but nonetheless, he's asserting that. All the more so with figures from Tanakh. Okay, so look, the reason I'm choosing to answer this question is because it's a question that I've heard many times over the years. So, good question. Kind of. So the first thing that I'll take issue with is the fact that the questioner, who's from Brooklyn, says that they consistently sinned. So that's first of all not true, right? I mean, it's very important to recognize that in the stories of Bnei Israel in the Midbar, of the 40 years in the desert, we are only told about 2.5 years. And the great deal of sin that is significant in that time happens in the beginning, right? And then there's like 38.5 years that are not even mentioned, which means that they were uneventful, right? Which means that there wasn't really a great deal of problematic stuff going on at all during the vast majority of those 40 years. So that's the first thing that I'll take issue with. The second is, even in those times that are spoken of, it's not consistent sin, right? There's minor elements. So what are the major issues? There's the Egel HaZahav, there's the Miragelim, and then there are these minor issues of kind of, starvation that they cry for and have a problem in dealing with, which is very understandable and normal. There's problems of thirst because of days without water. That is completely understandable and normal. And that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is training them to respond to his engagement. Or, it says, there's this amazing pasuk in Yehezkel, I think, pasuk Yehezkel in Kaf, Per Kaf, pasuk Gima. Let me see if I can pull it up for you here. Yeah. It says, Vayamru bi Bet Israel bamidbar, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying that the Bnei Israel rebelled against me in the desert. Bechukotai lo halachu. They didn't keep my laws, Bet mishpatai ma'asu, and they rejected my judgments. Asher yaseh otam adam v'chai bahem, that a person should do them and live by them. V'shabbatotai hilelu me'od, it says, and they desecrated my Shabbatot exceedingly. So, I mean, this apparently goes in line with the questioner, right? But let's think about this, right? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying this, what is he referring to? First of all, I mean, the fact that they were what does Rashi say? Rashi says that they didn't walk in my lo halachu bechukotai lo halachu, the golden calf. That was the major thing. And in Refidim, that there was kind of a bit of a resistance receiving Torah. And what about Shabbatotai Chilelu Me'od? What about the Shabbatot that were Mechulalim tremendously? Well, that was when they went out and tried to get man on Shabbat. Okay, I mean, so this is not consistently sinning. This you have to recognize as a prototypical people that are beginning to understand what it means to have a real mature relationship with God. When you say that they were close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it doesn't mean that they were extremely sophisticated in their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was almost like a mother to an infant. So is the infant extremely close to the mother when the baby's an infant? Absolutely. I mean, can't do anything without the mother. Is held very, very close to the mother. But the infant is not at all equipped to be able to run a proper, mature, mutual relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's going to do a bunch of things wrong, and the mother's going to punish that child or discipline that child appropriately. So that's the reason why. Now, David HaMelech is a little bit different than that. So I wouldn't put David HaMelech together with the Dor HaMidbar. So that's how I'm explaining the Dor HaMidbar, right? To understand that. And then when we're talking about these massive, this consistent sins, these are not consistent. One more thing that I will say is that the sin of the Egel and the sin of the Meragilim, which are the two major problems, which is why the two times that HaKadosh Baruch Hu indeed wanted to wipe the people out, or at least suggested that he was going to wipe the people out, we're still dealing with today. So it's wrong to say that we've kind of grown out of this and we don't have this problem anymore. We are still dealing with those problems today. In what form? Well, we're still fasting over them. And we're not fasting over them in a commemorative sense, which I've spoken about many times. So you can hear, any of the shiurim that I've given on the fast days or about the fast days. We're fasting over the Egel HaZahav on Shabbat B'Tammuz, and we're fasting over the Meraglim on Tisha B'Av. And that means that those elements are fundamental to humanity, right? Certainly to humanity. And they're elements that Bnei Israel, Am Israel, still need to refine and deal with. So it doesn't mean that we haven't made progress. Sure, we made progress, but we're not done with the progress. And it started 3,000 years ago, and we're still working on it. So it's not to be, seen as just some, tremendous mess up that doesn't make sense. That's that. With regards to David HaMelech and Bathsheba, the Hachamim deal with this. And it's important to understand that this is the problem of sophistication, right? There's something dangerous that comes with a high level of relationship and, for that matter, a high level of refinement. And the way that the Gemara genuinely presents is that there are errors in judgment. And there are errors in judgment because of the subtleties of the details that run on the level of that kind of life, right? Where a person is running and dealing with judgments and realities, in where the discernment oftentimes is the difference, differences like a razor's edge. So remember that this is Bathsheba that we're talking about. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very, very upset about this, right? He says that there was a bizayon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name publicly. David HaMelech loses a child as a result of this. It's a very serious thing, but recognize he does end up marrying Bathsheba. And the child that comes from his union with Bathsheba is Shlomo HaMelech, who builds the Bet HaMikdash. So this is not a small thing, right? So when I say that these discernments are genuinely living on a razor's edge, I mean it. Yeah. And the Hachamim definitely recognize this in their discussion of it. And that is why, in Masechet Sukkah it says, for example, right? There's another aspect of it, and that is that the greater a person is, the greater the Yetzer is for the person. The Yetzer Hara. Why? Well, the greater a person is, that means that the greater of a thinker the person is, the greater capacity to be able to understand, engage in a world the person is, the broader a person's frame of reality that person has. And if that's the case, that means that the yetzer, that the creative abilities of the person are greater, right? The things that the person has capacity to entertain, the options and choices that a person has capacity to entertain are greater simply because his broader frame of knowledge and awareness. And that means that in his yetzer capacity, he also has yetzer hara problems that are greater than everybody else. And there's a story that's told about this with regards to Abaye, and where he follows this this young couple who say we should travel together because we need to get to destinations in which the journey is the same way up until a certain point. He hears this, he's worried they're going to sin, he follows them, and he realized they don't sin, they're just perfectly innocent, and he kills himself over this, realizing that he would not have been so innocent had he gone on this journey, and so on and so forth. So there's that element to it as well, right? That the subtleties, the capacity to discern becomes tremendously more challenging when a person is greater, right? When a person grows in their sophistication of understanding the nature of reality in the world and their place in the world and so on and so forth. A simpleton has very little frame for real sin, very little frame. And in addition to that, there's a great story that I'll mention that's in Masechet Sanhedrin Kof Bet. One of my favorite stories in the Talmud, and where I think as Rav Asher was giving shiur, and he was doresh, on various things, and he got to a point in where he was going to speak about Menashe, the king of Israel. Right now, if you know anything about Menashe, the king of Israel, he was a very bad king. He was a wicked king. He was considered to be a rasha. Some of the Hachamim say that there was no avirah that he did not leave, that he didn't do, right? And so because he in general had a bad rap because of that, right? Rav Asher, when he was Doresh all day, and he got to the end of the day, and he said, okay, tomorrow we're going to speak about Havirenu Menashe. We're going to speak about our friend Menashe in a cheeky way, right? Talking about, he's not really our friend. He's not a Havir, because Havir means that, the Hachamim. So Menashe comes to him in a dream that night, and he says, tell me something, sir. Am I your friend or your father's friend that you dare call me, the king of Israel, your friend? He says, and on another note, I bet you don't even know the simplest halakha. Let me ask you a question. Where are you supposed to break the bread when you say hamotzi on Shabbat? That's what it says in his dream. Menashe asks him. And Rav Asher doesn't know how to answer the question. He says, I don't know. He goes, yeah, no, you don't know, do you? You don't know. Well, I'll tell you, you break the bread in the place that it is most finely baked, most well baked, right? Because out of kavod for Shabbat, that's where you break it. He said, well, I'm going to say this halacha in your name tomorrow, right? That's what you said. He said, but can I ask you a question if while I have you? Rav Asher says. He goes, what do you want? He says, how could you, somebody who's such a great hacham, right? So, and he says, you're such a great hacham. How could you have worshipped Avodah Zarah? And he says, how could I worship Avodah Zarah? He goes, I'll tell you something, Rav Asher. If you were alive in my time, you would have hiked your robe up so it wouldn't trip you while you were running after me to worship Avodah Zarah. You don't know what we had to deal with in our time. Right? So that's another aspect of it. It's important to be able to recognize that in all of these situations, context is everything, right? And there's another story that, Rabbeinu Hari tells Maharfur Rabbi Haim Vital. Rabbi Haim Vital, because the Ari told Rabbi Haim Vital that when he was teaching him all of the concepts of Kabbalah that he was teaching him, he said, you should know that I only came to teach you and that I really only have permission to teach you these concepts. And Rabbi Haim Vital took the Ari at his word, and he said, but how could you say, look at who's living in our generation, in our city, for goodness sakes. I mean, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo and Maharam al-Sheikh, Rabbi Moshe al-Sheikh, and all of these people. And he said, and even if those people, what about all of the great Rishonim that came before us? And the Ari says to him, everybody in their generation, and it is very likely that the people in the previous generations would not have been able to stand against the things that you have to deal with, Chaim, in this generation, and vice versa, right? And that's very much the truth. I mean, who knows what would have happened to certain people in past history if they had to deal with Instagram and things like that. We have absolutely no idea with all of the things that we have to deal with today. So in all of that, right? Recognize that the discernment with regards to David HaMelech is extremely high, and it is a razor's edge. And one minor miss has catastrophic implications. And that's something that's mentioned in the Talmud as well. Svivav nis'ara me'od, that around HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is very stormy. And the Hachamim make a play on the word, nis'ara. And they say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with his close ones, kehuta se'ara, like the fine breath of a hair. So that's the first thing. The second thing, like I said, again, just to recap, is that David HaMelech was of a great stature, and therefore his Yetzer Hara was not a simple Yetzer Hara. It was a very, very powerful Yetzer that needed to be dealt with on very high levels. As we said from the Gemara in Sukkah, Kol shegadol mimeno yitzro gadol, Kol shegadol mehavero yitzro gadol mimeno, and finally this thing about Menashe, about the context, right? If tells Rav Asher, the architect of the Talmud Bavli, that if you were living in my time, you would have hiked up your robe so it shouldn't trip you as you were running after me to worship Avodah Zarah. And that's something that Rav Asher doesn't contend with. He recognizes. Okay, so just to answer that question. Number 3. What are your thoughts on eating non-marked foods, especially abroad, as long as caution is being taken to determine any non-kosher ingredients and so on? Or is it easier / better to always be stringent in these matters by not eating them? Question from New York. Okay, so the answer to this question, first of all, is there are 2 parts to the answer of this question. The first part is it's important to recognize that there were not always marks on foods for all of Jewish history, right? There was law of kashrut and what we were allowed and not allowed to eat. And we had to determine those things, right, where we were. Wherever it is that we were, we had to determine those things. Now, it's true that there were foods that might have had mixtures. And do I know what's in the mixtures of the foods? Well, not necessarily. Then the question comes, do I have to consider that food guilty until proven innocent? And the answer, basically, in the halakha is no. The food is innocent until proven guilty. And the term for that in halakha is ihzuke isura lo mehaskina. We do not establish a hazakah of isur. We do not establish an assumption and assertion of firm isur for no reason, unless there is some reason that we should assume that there is isur, right? Unless there's some indication that we should assume isur. So a food in general is innocent until proven guilty. Now, based on that, especially today, we have a better circumstance in that ingredients are usually printed on the foods that we consume in commercial circumstances. And in the United States and in the United Kingdom, the ingredients are listed by order of amount, right? In terms of how much there is in the food, right? And essentially, if a person reads the ingredients and doesn't see anything that is unkosher in the ingredients, according to strict halakha, a person can assume that that food is kosher. This is something that I can tell you, that my own Rosh Yeshiva, the former chief rabbi of Israel, Chacham Yitzhak Yosef, told me, and my own mother-in-law told me, Chacham Ovadia used to do. Chacham Ovadia Yosef used to read ingredients and give them to eat, right? If he saw nothing in the ingredients. He actually says that there was a particular case where there was bazooka gum, and he wanted the bazooka when he was a little kid, and his father read the ingredients, Chacham Ovadia, and he gave him the gum to eat. He didn't have a mark, not mark. That is the basic halakha. And that is the truth, right? So ostensibly, with regards to your question, yes, you can read ingredients with one major caveat, and this is a major caveat. You need to know what the ingredients are. And today, the ingredients are not so straightforward. If they're straightforward, if it's like, corn, salt, water, great, that's fine. But if you can pave, the road with the ingredients that are in this thing, you really do need to know what these ingredients are. And if you don't know, that's not enough just to say, okay, it's innocent until proven guilty. It's being shown to you, right? You have evidence of what is actually in this, and you need to be able to know what it is. So you have to be honest about that and truthful about that and be clear on the fact that when you read, magnesium stearate, that you know that could be derived from animal, right? Like steer. Oftentimes, as a matter of fact, majority of times it isn't. It's usually chemical now, but you need to know what these things are, and you need to know well what these things are. So In principle, yes, one can rely on ingredients to determine whether one can eat food or not. However, in practicality, nowadays, for many things, it's very difficult to be able to do that because you don't necessarily know what it is. You do have an internet, right? And you do have an ability in ChatGPT and who knows what else, where you can kind of put this stuff in and get some pretty decent information with regards to that. And if you can, then fine. But otherwise, a person needs to be truthful and recognize whether you genuinely do know what these things are or not. So I'll leave it at that. Number 4, or fourth question. Some people say that there are no halachic issues with using electricity to turn on LED lights in one's own home. I don't know what the difference between one's own home or anywhere else is with regards to it, but nonetheless, what are the considerations one should have when thinking about this for one's own home? And what would you say about people turning on lights on Shabbat? This is from London. Okay, so first of all, I would say there is no distinction between one's own home or anywhere else with regards to that. If it is permitted, it's permitted. If it's not permitted, it's not permitted. It's not any more or less permitted in your own home than it is anywhere else, right? Now, the thing with regards to this, look, with all of these halachic questions, I just want to say that we could properly and appropriately give a full shiur on this, that would fill the entire hour of time to be able to properly unpack this, right? So I'm recognizing, I want to make it very clear that when I answer these things, it should be understood by anybody who's hearing that I am giving you essentially a Pesach on this thing, and I'm not giving a full shiur on all of the wiring of this thing. And so when I explain the bit that I do explain, there's a lot that I'm not explaining. Okay, so anybody wants to take issue with it or question, you're very welcome to. But I want you to understand that the reasoning that I'm giving here is not the entirety of the subject. That said, there is a big question with regards to electricity, which the reason I'm saying all of that is because it requires careful study and understanding, right? Is there a prohibition with regards to electricity on Shabbat, and for that matter, on Yom Tov? And this question was specifically with regards to Shabbat. There are many opinions with regards to this, and there are many ways of approaching it. My personal opinion, and it's my personal opinion, and it is an opinion essentially that this is shared with Chacham Ovadia Yosef Zecher Tzadik Levracha and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who Chacham Ovadia based much of his understanding and opinions on Rav Shlomo Zalman. And that is, first of all, that if there is at all a prohibition of electricity, it's a rabbinic prohibition, right? It's not a deoraita prohibition. Rav Asher Weiss doesn't rule that way. He has a different approach to it. He holds that it's well, I don't want to get into the details of what it is that he holds because it also requires an explanation. But he bases it on Yerushalmi, in where Rish Lakish holds that if you can't find a melacha for something, that then you can say then it should be considered makeh patish. And if it's makeh patish, then it's a melacha and it's an isur deoraita. But again, my rabbi was not posek like that. I'm not posek like that. So at best, it's an isur derabanan. But you're not asking about electricity as much as you're asking about the LED light. So the electricity itself, right? It is the truth of the matter is it's even difficult to consider it an isur derabanan. What exactly the isur might be is not at all clear. And the LED lights are also no different than electricity itself, as far as I'm concerned, right? There is a very big difference between LED lights and incandescent lights, right? Incandescent lights actually have a metal filament that becomes white hot, and by that gives light, and that is a gahedet shel matechet, right? That is essentially fire, even though there's no flame. As far as halakha is concerned, that's very serious and very problematic on Shabbat, and for that matter, Yom Tov. I don't think that it is all permitted to turn on an incandescent light on Yom Tov. But on Yom Tov, it's an Isur D'Rabbanan, whereas on Shabbat, it's an Isur D'Oraita. But incandescent lights are rare today. It's very difficult to find them anywhere today. Most of the time, it's LED lights. LED lights, I don't see any particular prohibition to. And if there is a prohibition, it's an Isur D'Rabbanan. Why am I saying that? Because the reality is that for the most part, and I know that there are many, many people who disagree with this, and it's understandable. The reason for not doing this essentially is minhag, right? It became Minhag Israel not to use electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov. I very strongly endorse and agree with this minhag, and I think that it should be kept by everybody, because if we were not to keep this minhag, for all intents and purposes, I think that the entirety of Shabbat and Yom Tov would unravel. Genuinely, I do believe that. Do I have the capacity to say that it's an isur, or do we have the capacity to make a gezerah, decree against it? I don't personally believe that we do, but I do believe that it is a very strong minhag that we should not break. And that's it. That's my opinion, right? So that's how I hold. I think that those who want to say that it's an isur d'Rabbanan have to explain why it's an isur d'Rabbanan. What exactly is the rabbinic isur that's going on over here? I hear Rav Asher in his approach. He's making an isur d'oraita because of makev patish. The Chazon Ish wanted to make an isur d'oraita because of boneh, by closing the circuit. It's actually building. Hacham Ovadia refuted that and said that it's en binyan bekelim and other reasons. But nonetheless, that's how I understand it. So it doesn't matter whether it's in your own home or someone else's own home. Absolutely, people should absolutely not be using electricity or turning lights on Shabbat, but for the reasons that I explained. Right now, it makes implications in terms of questions, in terms of sickness, in terms of these things, and so on and so forth, which are not what you're asking. Okay, and next another Halakhic question. Why does eruv? I actually like this question. This is an interesting one. Why does eruv tavshilin allow you to do any kind of preparation from Yom Tov to Shabbat, and not just being able to only cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat? And that's a question from Queens, New York. It's a good question. And I will say that from the question, it seems to me that this person is familiar with halakha, because to ask the question, you have to be able to recognize that there's a question to ask here. And there is a question to ask, because if you think about it, what is eruv tavshilin? I mean, eruv tavshilin, essentially, like in all of these yamim tovim that we just had, we've had to do an eruv tavshilin, because at least outside of Eretz Israel, because we've had a Yom Tov adjacent to Shabbat, and halakha is that we're really not meant to prepare on Yom Tov for any other day, and for that matter, for Shabbat. And the eruv tavshilin allows for us to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat, right? Even though the basic halakha is that we're not really allowed to do anything on Yom Tov for Shabbat. Notice, though, that it is called eruv tavshilin. Tavshil literally means a cooked item, right? A dish that's cooked. And the truth of the matter is that when it's spoken about in the Talmud, it really only talks about it in terms of cooking. It does say hachana, right, talking about preparation, but it really only talks about it in terms of cooking. Harambam, the Rif and Harambam, when they write the laws of Eruv Tavshilin, only write about baking and cooking. They don't write about anything else, any other kinds of preparations. So there are various levels of complication with regards to this. First of all, the way that it's presented in the Talmud, right? So there's arguments as to why is it not prohibited mideoraita? What are the reasons that the Torah would not have prohibited preparing on Yom Tov for Shabbat? And that means then that it's an isur d'Rabbanan, which is how it is that we are posek, right? That the prohibition of preparing from Yom Tov to Shabbat is a rabbinic prohibition. And then the question is, in the Gemara, what exactly does the eruv tavshilin do, right? How does it work in order to be able to allow for the preparation? Now, I'm not going to get into all of that, but I will recognize, what we need to recognize is that if it is in Isur D'Rabbanan, which we determine it is, then the Hachamim are the ones who prohibit it, and the Hachamim are the ones who can permit it. And the Hachamim did not simply want to just permit. They wanted to maintain the prohibition and allow for a mechanism that opens up the allowance to be able to do this. And what essentially is their eruv? Like Harambam writes in the halachot in Halachot Shevitat Yom Tov in Perek Vav, he says that the reason for the eruv is in order to be able to make a heker. It's so that I recognize that I need to have some allowance in order to be able to do this. And what exactly is the recognition? That I've begun preparing for Shabbat before Yom Tov, right? Not on Yom Tov. And then I continue that work, right? That runs into Yom Tov. Okay, so there's that allowance for it. So the question of why does it allow for other things, that's also not so pashut. Right? Not also simple. There are opinions among the Rishonim that hold that the only problem of preparation is the cooking, because that's a major thing. I mean, that's going to take your whole Yom Tov, right? You're going to spend Yom Tov and start cooking for Shabbat. To light a candle, that's not the Hachamim. We're not so concerned about that. Or to, whatever else it might be, maybe making an Uber or something of that nature. The Hachamim, we're not so concerned about that. But with regards to cooking and baking, there needed to be a hikr for regards to that. Other opinions say, no, it's prohibited to do any of those things, and the eruv allows the other things because they're minor and come under the elements of cooking. So once you started your cooking, it's indicated that you've essentially, anything else that you're going to do is going to be something that either is around cooking or dealing with cooking, or it's some sub-element that is not significant in and of itself, and so it's subsumed within the eruv. Others say that really there's certain things the eruv just simply does not permit, right? So it doesn't necessarily permit for you to do things that don't have to do with the cooking or these sub-elements of melacha, right? Maybe, are you allowed to set the table on Yom Tov for Shabbat, before Shabbat comes in, and so on and so forth. So all of those issues. The final thing that I will say is the reason, the ultimate, and then there's questions about, if I don't say, when I bake the eruv, and I don't say this eruv is going to allow me to do X, Y, and Z, can I do X, Y, and Z without saying it? Also a whole discussion with regards to that. Some say yes, some say no. Ultimately, we allow it, like you're indicating in your question. Ultimately, we allow it, whether you said it, you didn't say it. If you made an eruv tavshdin kadin, we do allow for these preparations. And the reason for that basically is safek de Rabbanan nekula. That because all of these are questions in terms of different opinions amongst the hachamim, and we're dealing with the din de Rabbanan, in the sefekot, we allow for you to go lekula instead of lechumrah. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. But I being that it seems that you're, engaged in the halachot, I encourage you to be able to go through this and learn this through the Rishonim. There's different opinions amongst the Rishonim. I mean, it's really a fascinating topic, actually, and it's shayach to go through. Number 6. To what extent is one allowed, reading this, to what extent is one allowed to pick and choose between halakhic opinions? There's a lot of assumption there, right? For example, could you follow Rambam or Hilchot Tefillah, but follow Shulchan Aruch for Hilchot Kashrut? Okay, so first of all, I'll say this. There is no halakha that you have to follow any one opinion, right? If you know the halakha. So if a person is able to understand the halakha and rule on the halakha, there's no obligation to follow anyone outside of the Talmud, right? We all have an obligation to follow the Pesakim of the Talmud, but other than that, there's no proper obligation to follow anyone. If you are a proper posek and you're going to be moreh halacha, right? Even Hacham Ovadia is moreh halacha against Shulchan Aruch in several places. And I would encourage you to, for the person who wrote this, he's writing this from Melbourne, Australia. For whoever's in writing question, I would encourage you, if you have access to Hacham Ovadia's Halichot Olam, that he wrote on the Ben Ish Hai, I would encourage you to see Chelik Bet of Halichot Olam in the Ben Ish Hai, the Hakdama, Hacham Ovadia's introduction there, and where he gives a whole bunch of Mekorot that it is absolutely permitted for a Talmid Hacham, and not only permitted, but obligated for a Talmid Hacham who recognizes a halakha to be a certain way, and this is his understanding of the halakha, that he has to be posek that way and run that way. And the reason why, of course, Hacham Ovadia is writing this in the opening of Halichot Olam is because the whole book is a book that is arguing with the Ben Ish Hai and ruling against the Ben Ish Hai, right? And so he wanted to give reason for why it is that he's ruling against the Ben Ish Hai when the Ben Ish Hai was so recognized and accepted as a Pusek Hador and so on and so forth. So that's number one. But of course, I'm saying that for people who know how to be posek, right? Who have the authority to be posek, right? And again, a person has to be able to know their capacity to be able to do this. But if a person does not know the halacha and they are not able to be posek, they can't pick and choose anything because they don't have the knowledge with which to pick and choose. So they have to have a rav that they ask, right? And there is an obligation to ask, right? There's an obligation to ask and ask a person who does know the halacha, and that's what you do, right? So you don't just kind of look things up and follow. You need somebody who's going to provide for you a frame of halacha and be able to guide you appropriately in terms of the halacha, and that's what's appropriate to do. It's not appropriate just to simply look through books and choose what it is that you want to do from the books because you happen to know how to read. right? You know how to read Yalkut Yosef, so you're going to figure out what you feel like doing from the Yalkut Yosef, or you know how to read in English, Halakhic, Halakhic book presentations. You're going to choose to do. That's not how that works. A person is not able to do that, right? So that a person needs to be able to ask a Talmid Chacham who understands the halacha and follow that. That's really what the appropriate thing is to do. And that is my advice to you. Next question. 7. How should the loss of a beloved rabbi within a specifically difficult wartime for Israel be interpreted by a community, especially just before Rosh Hashanah? This is a question from France. So I'm not 100% clear on the basis for asking the question, but I'm going to answer the question anyway. The way I understand the question is that how should one or a community find meaning in the loss of a great rabbi, especially in such difficult times? So my first response to that is we can't know why a person is taken, right? Why a person dies. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that. But what I can say is that it's important for us to understand that the world is moving and that the generations are passing and that the paradigms are shifting and that people die. And that happens in terms of the world's change. And so it's very difficult because what we're watching, I believe anyway, what we're watching in our times is the world genuinely moving from one paradigm to another. And we are observing the shift. And it's extremely disheartening and difficult to observe the shift because everything that we believed in terms of what things mean, all the institutions that we kind of were able to lean upon. When I say all, it may not be all, but a tremendous portion of the institutions and institutional meanings that we have been used to and grown up on are shifting and being redefined. And along with that comes the loss of people, right? I mean, that's obvious that time goes on, we lose people, but if you're asking for an element of meaning in it, the leaders of one generation cannot be the leaders of the next. And oftentimes that's the case, that shift is very, very painful and difficult to observe. So I don't know, what the circumstances of this person dying, and I very much hesitate, and I'm very reticent about giving any kind of meaning to a death. And I think we all should be. But in a broad frame, I'm simply speaking about the world and its movements. And it's important to kind of be able to take things in from within that awareness of how it is that the world is moving and what it's running to, and that every generation has its leaders, and that the leaders of the previous generation are not necessarily the right leaders of a later generation. Next question, number 8. What are the definitions of a minhag ta'ut and a minhag shetut? A minhag ta'ut literally means a mistaken custom, and a minhag shtut means a silly custom, or not an intelligent custom. And should a person refuse to participate in a fallacious custom, even if it has been in practice by most of the Jewish people for hundreds of years? This sounds to me like a loaded question, because it sounds to me like you have something specific in your mind that you're asking. And this is a question from Muncie, New York, in the US, which I have no idea what it is that you're actually asking. But I will simply respond to what are the definitions of minhag ta'ut and minhag shetut. Minhag ta'ut is what it sounds like. It's a mistaken minhag, which essentially means that it's a minhag that goes against halacha. But it's a minhag that goes against clear halacha, right? So, for example, there's a custom in the Spanish-Portuguese community that is shared by many Moroccans, and it's almost positive. I'm almost positive that it only is a minhag in the Spanish-Portuguese community because of the Moroccans, because we had many Moroccan rabbis historically in the community. That, for example, when I'm saying kiddush, or when you're saying a beracha that is meant to fulfill the obligation of those listening, in the S&P and in the many Moroccan communities, they will answer Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo to that bracha, right? So if I'm saying Borei Pri Hagefen in Kiddush for a whole bunch of people, right, and I say Baruch Atah Hashem, the whole kahal will answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, and I'll say Baruch Pri Gefen. Now, according to the majority of people, that's a terrible mistake to do that. Why is it a terrible mistake to do that? Because you need to be quiet when you're hearing that beracha, because the beracha is being spoken for you on your behalf as if you are saying the beracha. So if you were saying the beracha, you would not say, if you were saying, holding the cup of wine of kiddush and saying the beracha, you would not say Baruch Atah Hashem Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo Borei Pri Gefen. Neither should the listeners, ostensibly. And Hacham Ovadia is posek like that, and many poskim posek like that, but that's not the minhag, right, of the Moroccans and the S&P. Is that a minhag ta'ud? It's not a minhag ta'ud. Rav Shalom Mashash, who was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem for many years, who was a Moroccan, he writes many teshuvot on this issue and asserts very strongly that it's not a minhag ta'ud. There's strong halakhic basis for it, and so on and so forth. Why am I saying this? It's only an example. But essentially the question is there halakhic basis for it? If there's halakhic basis for it, and more importantly, it was established or instigated or essentially begun on some level by the influence of a hacham or hachamim, then the likelihood is it's not a minhag ta'ud, right? It's not going against halakha. If it can be found to be directly against something that the Talmud rules on, and there is no room for interpretation of the Talmud in that way, and there are no hachamim that interpret the Talmud in that way, and it's clear that this is just the wrong thing to do, well then, right, yeah, you can say that it's a minhag ta'ud, and it should be stopped, regardless of how long it's been done. A minhag shetut is a little bit different, right? It's all of the above, plus it's folly, right? It's folly in that it is based on real silly ideas, right? So a lot of minhagim kind of that are based on superstitions that have absolutely nothing to do with halakha or the hachamim or the corpus of Jewish law at all, right? That many communities have, can be considered like as minhag shetut. Right, and those are kind of a lot of the superstitions that communities have and do. Yeah, so there you are. There you are. I hope that definition helped. Let's see. So whether you should stop doing it or not, again, it all depends on what it is that you're referring to and whether there's room for that to be, basis for it or not. Outside of that, I will say one should be very wary about stopping minhagim, because it is terribly damaging and dangerous to do so, because you pull one thread, you don't realize what it is that you're unraveling. And there's much more to that, right, that I can add. There's Gemaran Pesachim that says, Davar she'nahagu bo isur atar asher latir bivneim, that if people, for example, held something as being, they were mahmir on something and treated as asur, that you're not allowed to start treating it as mutar in front of them. Again, it's fragile. The manipulation of these behaviors affects the thread and the weave, essentially, of the community and how it is that it's held together. And the Hamon Ha'am, the general populace, who are not really clear on the wiring and, for that matter, the weaving, and they just simply see a tapestry in front of them, begin to lose their footing when these things happen. So it's one has to be very careful about that. Rabbi Elia alav shalom, my colleague and the rabbi who was rabbi in community and at Lauderdale Road for decades, he said that when Hacham Ovadia Yosef came to visit the S&P in London, they actually sat and asked him which minhagim are appropriate and which ones should we consider changing. And he said, don't change any of them. You all had great hachamim for your whole history. Why would you begin to change any of your minhagim? All right, number 9. Okay, let's see, what's our time? Oh, it's 9:25. Okay, I think I can do these. Okay, so number 9. Why was Hava tempted by the Nahash? And why couldn't she say, no, thank you for your offer? It's a good question, right? Well, what I will have you consider is the following. Recognize, right, that first of all, in Gan Eden, the Nahash is present. What's he doing there? It's a very important question to ask, right? Why would, in this kind of, as we say, Edenic environment, right? This kind of, paradise of sorts, which is what Gan Eden is usually seen to be. What on earth is that serpent doing there? Why is he included in that space? Well, at the very least, it tells you that there's not something, that this space is not entirely perfect, that there is room for failure, as the final, fate indicates. And therefore, the answer is relatively straightforward. The Nahash spoke Lashon Hara to her. And Lashon Hara, the aim of all Lashon Hara is to manipulate the thinking and experience and understanding of the person who's hearing it. And the problem was that she accepted it. And if you look at those Pesukim, you will see that it is indeed very cunning. Right? The Nahash is introduced in the Torah as being the most cunning. And what the Nahash does to her is absolutely cunning. And she gets so confused that she brings confusion that he doesn't even introduce. So all he does at the beginning, he says, I heard that God said you can't eat any of the trees of the garden, right? Which is the first thing, the first kind of, what do you call it? Maybe the first indication that he's kind of messing around with her experience. And she goes, oh, no, silly snake. God didn't say that we can't eat of all of the trees. There's only one tree that we're not allowed to eat from. And here already her confusion is, her footing is off, because she said we're not allowed to eat of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, which is not right. At least not based on the Pesukim, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says they're not allowed to eat of the Etz Hadat Tov Hara. It's only the Etz Haim that's B'toch Hagan, that's in the middle of the garden. And then there's a whole dialogue back and forth. And that is really why she can't say no thank you. She doesn't say no thank you because her mind is being manipulated. Now, it's not like it's a trance or a spell. She has the ability to be able to not accept Lashon Hara, but she does. She accepts it. And she engages with it. And it's the engagement that's the problem. It's the openness of her to be able to think in these terms that's the problem. And that happens to every single one of us. And that's why. The same reason we don't say no thank you to all the things we should say no thank you to. Right? Okay. I think I'm going to end here. So apologies for not answering any of the questions that were submitted. They were all very interesting and interesting questions. But I'm going to leave it here. I hope those were helpful, and keep them coming, as we will do another Q&A, I think, in another month. Other than that, I want to thank everyone for coming along tonight, and I want to thank everybody who always helps and supports the Habura, for you, Ohad, and I see Avi's there. Hello, Avi. And of course, Reb Sina, and everybody who lends their hand to make sure that the Habura is alive and well and doing well, and everybody's should be blessed for that, and they should have zechut for that, and Yihiratzon, we should be able to continue strong, and wonderful to be able to share some Divrei Torah. And so I wish everyone, as it's coming up, a Shabbat Shalom, and keep it strong. Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi. Chodesh Tov. Shabbat Shalom.
Chodesh Tov, Kol Tov.
Everyone.